This is the most twisted serial life-taker duo you have never heard of. One kept corpses as roommates for months, the other wrote a philosophical manifesto on murder. What they did to their victims will haunt you forever. You have to stick around until the end to hear the one clue that finally brought them down. Dennis Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in the grey fishing town of Fraserburgh, Scotland, a place where the sea ruled everything and where silence could drown out even the loudest voices. His father, a Norwegian soldier, was more a memory than a presence, disappearing when Dennis was still small. His mother remarried quickly, filling the house with new siblings and a stepfather who barely looked his way. Dennis learned early what it meant to feel like a shadow in his own home. But there was one person who saw him. His grandfather, a fisherman whose quiet kindness made the boy feel wanted, if only briefly. He was the first man Dennis ever adored, the only man he would later say had ever truly loved him. When Dennis was 6, that fragile sense of belonging was torn away. His grandfather drowned at sea. They did not soften the blow. They brought Dennis to view the body, dressed in Sunday clothes, gray and lifeless in a coffin. For most children, such a sight would be trauma. For Dennis, it was a seed. Death was no longer abstract, it was stillness, control, possession. Something about that moment carved itself into him so deeply that he never escaped it. As he grew, his fascination with death intertwined with isolation. Realizing he was gay, he hid it fiercely in a Scotland that punished difference with cruelty. He longed for closeness but could not reach for it openly. He drifted instead into silence, into fantasy. Joining the British Army as a chef gave him discipline, but not companionship. He followed orders, chopped vegetables, cooked for soldiers, but inside, his desires twisted. He did not want living partners. He wanted bodies that could never walk away. He wanted men still, silent, incapable of rejection. By the late 1970s, he was living in London, first with flatmates, then alone. At 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, he found the perfect stage for his obsession. On December 30th, 1978, his chance came. 14-year-old Stephen Holmes, too young to be drinking in a pub, accepted Nilsen's offer of a place to crash. In the morning, when Stephen said he needed to leave, Nilsen panicked. Abandonment, the return of emptiness, was unthinkable. He unalived Stephen with a necktie. He bathed the body, dressed it, laid it in his bed, and spoke to it as though Stephen could still hear. For 7 months, the corpse remained in his flat, hidden but not forgotten, his silent partner in evenings spent watching television. Only when the rot overwhelmed him did Nilsen burn the body in a bonfire, burying the ashes beneath paving stones. From there, the pattern formed. Lure, unalive, keep. Kenneth Ockenden, 23, unalived with headphone cords as music played. John Howlett, who fought so hard that Nilsen had to unalive him in a bathtub. Malcolm Barlow, a vulnerable young man whom Nilsen first saved by calling an ambulance, then later unalived when he returned to thank him. At times, there were 3 bodies in the flat, one under floorboards, another in a wardrobe, a third stuffed into a cupboard. The smell seeped through the walls, neighbors complained, but no one guessed. Nilsen masked it with incense, bleach, and open windows. In 1982, he invited a man named Carl Stoddard home. After a night of drinking, he tried to unalive Carl with a zipper, but suddenly he changed. He pulled Carl out, revived him, and held him until morning. Carl left confused, convinced it had been a drunken nightmare. Only later would he realize he had survived a serial life-taker. When Nilsen moved to 23 Cranley Gardens, his disposal methods changed. Without floorboards, he cut his victims into pieces and flushed them. But flesh clogs drains. In February 1983, plumbers investigating complaints pulled chunks of human remains from the pipes. Police confronted Nilsen. He didn't resist. "It's a long story," he told them. "I'll tell you everything." And he did 15 or 16 murders, corpses bathed, dressed, kept like companions. The trial began in October 1983, and the courtroom was suffocating with tension. Nilsen appeared calm, detached, almost bored. His defense argued insanity, painting him as a man lost in delusion, incapable of knowing right from wrong. But the prosecution revealed the truth. He had gone to work daily, bought groceries, paid bills, all while hiding bodies under floorboards. He had written notes, kept order, lied to neighbors. His crimes were deliberate, methodical. Witnesses brought the horror to life. Carl Stoddard, his voice trembling, recounted the night he awoke choking, how he felt Nilsen's hands on him, how he later realized he had been drowned and revived only by whim. Jurors stared at him, some pale, some angry, all shaken by the quiet terror of survival. Photographs of dismembered remains and clogged drains were presented. Some jurors turned away, others wiped tears. When the verdict came, guilty on 6 counts of life-taking, 2 of attempted life-taking, the silence in the courtroom was heavy. Nilsen showed no emotion. On November 4, 1983, he was sentenced to life without parole. He spent 35 years in prison, granting interviews where he described his crimes with eerie detachment, as though he were explaining recipes. He died in 2018, 72 years old, unclaimed, his body as unwanted in death as the bodies he hoarded in life. Yet while Britain tried to process the horror of Dennis Nilsen, America was already haunted by another predator whose philosophy of unalive was his justification. Melvin David Rees was born in 1928 in Maryland. Unlike Nilsen, his childhood was not well documented. What stood out was his brilliance in music. He played piano, saxophone, clarinet with skill that won him attention in Washington, D.C. nightclubs. Friends remembered him as intense, magnetic, quoting Nietzsche and Freud, turning late-night conversations into debates about morality. He told them that life-taking wasn't necessarily wrong, that morality was subjective, that only by destroying something could you truly understand it. They thought he was eccentric, pretentious even. They laughed it off. But his words were confessions disguised as philosophy. In June 1957, near Annapolis, he acted. Margaret Harold, a government clerk, rode with her boyfriend down a country road when a green Chrysler forced them off. A man stepped out, calm, deliberate, fire weapon raised. Without a word, he unalived Margaret through the window. Her boyfriend fled across fields. Margaret was dragged from the car, stripped, assaulted, dumped in a ravine. Nearby, police found a cinderblock building filled with adult content photos, bondage gear, autopsy photos, clippings. On the wall hung a smiling yearbook portrait of a young woman. It was a shrine, a trophy, a warning. In January 1959, horror returned. Carol Jackson, his wife Mildred, and their daughters Susan, 5, and Janet, just 18 months, vanished returning from a family visit. Their car was found abandoned. Soon after, Carol's and her baby were found dead. Days later, Mildred and Susan were found in shallow graves beneath another cinderblock building. Susan had been fired once in the chest. The brutality shook Virginia and Maryland. The FBI joined the hunt. The break came from Glenn Moser, a former bandmate, who wrote a letter exposing Rees's dark obsessions and cold discussions of life-taking. Investigators traced him to Arkansas, where he lived quietly as a piano tuner. When they arrested him, he did not resist. In his saxophone case, they found the fire weapon used in the life-takings. His journals detailed fantasies of life-taking step by step, coldly clinical, devoid of remorse. His trial drew crowds, the courtroom packed with reporters and grieving families. Prosecutors read aloud from his journals. Jurors shifted uncomfortably as Rees's words described life-taking as though it were science. Margaret's boyfriend testified, reliving the night she was unalived. The Jackson family's relatives sat in silence, some weeping, as photographs of the shallow graves were displayed. The jury deliberated briefly before finding him guilty. He was sentenced to life. For 23 years, Rees remained in prison, never apologizing, never confessing remorse. He spoke of death as philosophy of enlightenment. He died in 1995, leaving questions about how many victims lay undiscovered. 2 men, Dennis Nilsen and Melvin David Rees, separated by an ocean, united by the quiet masks they wore. One sought companionship in corpses, the other validation in philosophy. Both sat calmly in courtrooms while jurors struggled to comprehend the scale of their evil. Both remind us that monsters do not always storm into view. Sometimes, they sit quietly at pubs or play saxophone in nightclubs, smiling politely, hiding horror until the day it spills into light. After hearing the stories of Dennis Nilsson and Melvin David Rees, what do you think drove them deeper into darkness, loneliness, philosophy, or choice? Do you believe society overlooked the signs, or were these men simply destined to become what they did? Which of their methods unsettles you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments and make sure to subscribe for more.